Here's the TLDR. Know how The Simpsons are notoriously known for predicting the future? Well, Greek myth was way more ahead of its time. This is the story of Persephone's abduction to the underworld, a tale as old as time yet so relevant to the horrors of climate change and power imbalance today. As legend goes, every year around planting season, the farmers and peasants of Greece revered two goddesses, one of spring and one of agriculture. They were an inseparable mother-daughter duo called Persephone and Demeter. Before sowing their seeds of grain, the civilians of Greece looked to the two to bless a fruitful harvest. And so, the duo worked closely with one another to sustain human life. You could not pull them apart if you tried. Well, one dark and ominous presence did try, and did succeed. Don't worry, greenhouse gases weren't a concern just yet. But back to this ominous figure. Hades didn't live on Mount Olympus with the other Greek gods. He lived in the underworld and was obligated to tend to the dead, alone. Desperate for companionship, Hades became obsessed with Demeter's beloved Persephone, like Loki's stalker-like. So he asked Zeus for Persephone's hand in marriage, and Zeus, being Persephone's father, allowed it. How could a father allow such a thing without his daughter's consent? To marry his brother? Her uncle? It's because Zeus, being the immoral god he is, had malicious intent. We'll get into that later, but don't act so surprised. We warned you about him in our past episodes. He knew of Hades' plan to abduct her, and Hades thought, if not now, then when? So, one day, as Persephone frolics on Mount Etna, a narcissus flower fascinates her. Captivated by its beauty and disassociated from the world around her, she plucks it from the ground. But in doing so, a rift forms in the earth, a rift from which Hades appears and abducts the young goddess. Demeter looks everywhere for her daughter, but she's nowhere to be found, and none of the other gods are letting up on what happened to her. Distraught and hopeless, Demeter asks Helios, the sun god, who tells her the truth about Hades' deal with Zeus. Furious, Demeter confronts Zeus and asks for her daughter's return, but Zeus refuses. The audacity! Instead, he disguises himself and violates Persephone, impregnating her. There are many iterations of Persephone's violation. Some versions say Hades did the crime, others say it was Zeus. So, because of the little information we have on that, we'll let it rest here. What we do know is that in Demeter's despair, she neglected her duties to cultivate crops. The soil became dry, the land barren. Vegetation was unimaginable as famine beset the Greeks. In the 1930s, the United States experienced something similar, the Dust Bowl. With today's understanding of the world around us, we know that the Dust Bowl happened as a result of poor farming techniques and extremely harsh drought conditions, which were pushed over the edge by climate change. But way back, when people couldn't explain this yet, blaming it on mythology and Demeter's grief seemed a-okay. Because of Demeter's despair and the lack of sustenance, human deaths compounded, leaving little people to worship the gods. They worried, as without humans, their godly duties would also grow unfulfilled. In protest, Demeter refused to alleviate the conditions on Earth until Persephone's safe return. So, Zeus had no other option but to compromise. Typical. Zeus the attention whore. Meanwhile, in the land of the dead, Persephone put up her own fight. When Hades captured her, she refused his advances, and though she was ravenous, Persephone would not eat. She craved fruit and grain and all things that reminded her of home. In the land of the dead, however, she eyed one fruit that begged to be eaten, a red and ripe pomegranate. Don't do it, girl! Food on Earth equals sustenance, but in the underworld, it means something else. In many cultures, accepting food from someone else establishes kinship. Did you think the underworld was an exception? Rules are rules, as they say, which means there was no way for Demeter to retrieve her daughter wholly, now that Persephone had subjected herself to an eternal bond with the land of the dead. But there was still the problem of humans dying. So Zeus allowed Persephone to return to her mother for 2/3 of the year, and as for the other third, it had to be with Hades in the underworld. Win-win? Sort of? It's said that this is how the seasons on Earth came to be. In Persephone's return, Demeter was filled with the utmost joy and satisfaction. Together, they gave way for flowers to blossom, crops to flourish, and food to nourish humans. They called her return spring. But when it was time for Persephone to visit Hades, Demeter lamented her daughter's departure. Therefore, a deep, cold, and dark winter fell upon the earth each time. Wintertime depression is real, folks. Eventually, people learned to cope during this season and prepared for it by saving their spring crops and learning to keep warm. In the same vein, with climate change, we have to constantly adapt our way of life too, because our planet is, well, our planet is...
The planet's on fire.
The abduction of Persephone is a timeless story that relates to our world even today. Though we have bigger terrestrial problems to be concerned with, as humans, we are in constant competition with one another for control and power. And eventually, as is the outcome of every war, both sides and innocent people are at a loss in some way. Like when Demeter lost Persephone's, Hades was still lonely for 2/3 of the year, and humans suffered because of both of them. Though this story is a myth, it's also an allegory. Human activity does affect our climate, changing the conditions around us for better or for worse. But, like Demeter and Persephone working together, note that collective action makes the world a better place.